Let people continue. I'm Suzanne Conklin-Akbari, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to today's panel titled Civilization, What's Up with That? This is one of Everyday Orientalism talks panels, and I have to thank Katrin Bluam for having done so much to organize online events that have opened out research-related issues into wider conversations that have all kinds of social, political, and cultural implications. Today's panel is co-sponsored by the University of Toronto's Institute for Islamic Studies. I'm really grateful to all of the panelists for joining today, grateful to Katrin for organizing us, and also grateful to Anver Amon for lending the Institute of the IIS to today's panel. I'm going to say just a couple of words about the topic that's brought us together today before introducing our panelists. And here I'm borrowing Katrin's words from the description. The ongoing freedom convoys and the Russian invasion of Ukraine have led to a substantial flow of public Orientalism, as well as to the normalized and conspicuous use of the words civilization and civilized, with or without the West or Western. Drawing from this highly historicized present moment, this panel gathers scholars working at the intersection of ancient, medieval, and Islamic history. Together, we reflect on questions such as, what are the ancient roots of the notion of civilization? How does the reality of the period spanning from the so-called classical past to the early Islamic period disrupt this narrative? What can teachers of ancient, medieval, and Islamic history contribute to shifting popular Eurocentric, Orientalist, and Islamophobic narratives? And how can scholars working at the intersection of antiquity and early Islam best contribute to public conversations about and the prevention of the rise of white supremacy, fascism, and ethno-nationalism? Speaking for myself, I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, to learning from our panelists. And I've been thinking a lot in particular about the ways in which quote unquote civilization and confessional identities are intertwined in this particular Orientalist dynamic. I'm really looking forward to that part of the conversation. We'll begin by hearing from each of our panelists, each of whom will speak for up to 10 minutes at the most, and then we'll have a round of discussion amongst the panelists before turning to questions from the audience and more discussion. And those who are attending, please use the Q&A to add your questions, and we'll be really eager to have your input. Total time, we're going to go for up to about 90 minutes or so, though we have a little flexibility if the urgency of the conversation demands it. So let me now introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be presenting. We're going to begin with Suleiman Dost. Suleiman is an assistant professor of late antiquity and early Islam. He works mainly on inscriptions and other documentary sources from late antique Arabia and Ethiopia. His research also covers the historical context in which the Quran emerged, as well as the history of its textual transmission. Before joining the University of Toronto, Dr. Dost was an assistant professor at Brandeis and held a year-long fellowship at the Anamed Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations, and he received his PhD from Chicago in 2017. Our second speaker is Heba Mostafa. She's assistant professor of Islamic art and architecture in the Department of the History of Art at the University of Toronto. She received her PhD from Cambridge's Department of Architecture in 2012 and holds degrees both in architecture and the history of Islamic architecture from Cairo University and AUC. Her research explores the formation of Islamic architecture through the lens of early Islamic sectarianism and governance, addressing the mediation of political conflict and confessional division through architecture at the intersection of politics and the sacred. She focuses on Islam's relationship to late antiquity, Christianity, and Judaism through commemorative architecture, pilgrimage, and ritual practice, focusing especially on Jerusalem and Cairo. Our third speaker will be Adam Benkato. Adam is an assistant professor and holder of the Bita Daryabari Presidential Chair in Iranian Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures at UC Berkeley. His research investigates a wide variety of textual and audio sources, ranging from late antique Iran and Central Asia to modern North Africa, through philological, sociolinguistic, and archive studies approaches. Our final panelist is Katrin Bluam, who is Associate Professor of Ancient History at the University of Toronto and UTSC, and co-founder of Everyday Orientalism. Her work centers on socioeconomic and environmental history with a focus on ancient and especially Roman Egypt, as well as on the ethics and decolonial entailments of antiquity-related fields. She's the author of several books, and I'm just going to mention a couple. Triangular Landscapes, Environment, Society, and the State in the Nile Delta under Roman Rule. She's also co-editor of the Nile Delta, Histories from Antiquity to the Modern Period, and a co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Classics and Postcolonial Theory. And I'm perhaps most excited about something I had the opportunity to read the introduction to, her upcoming monograph, which is called Inventing Alexandria. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining. And I'd like to invite Suleiman to begin. Would you like to share your screen?
And I'm unmuted, I believe. And can you guys see my screen? Excellent. I'm going to put it in the presentation mode, and there we go. Good morning, everyone. Let me first thank Katrin for bringing us together. We technically kind of organized this together, but she's always the galvanizer of the group. So thank you for that. Of course, thanks to Suzanne for chairing this, and IAS, and obviously my fellow panelists. My talk today will be, short and sweet, and I will mostly complain about our own practices of teaching and reproducing some of the things that we complain in this debate of civilization and the kind of stereotypes that people, and especially, I guess, non-academics like to talk about. And while I'll do this, I'll just focus on my own experience of teaching Roman history for the first time at UTSC this year, and the kind of things that I learned, and hopefully maybe even gather some thoughts and advice from people for better classroom practice. So I guess let me begin with that anecdote. This is my first year. I'm teaching a course called History and Culture of the Roman World. This is our part of classical studies program, and if you kind of look at the syllabus as it was taught by Katrin beautifully before, it begins with beginning of Rome and ends, at some point. I'm going to put it that way. It's we decide where to end this, and since I was given this task, and it's my first time teaching it, and I kind of learned it from people like the late Walter Kagi to include things that are necessarily not included in teaching Roman history. I said, I was thinking I'm going to add early Islam. I'm going to add maybe something from the Byzantine Empire, maybe as far as I can go. But immediately I realized if this is the title and if this is the course, I have to make a decision. In North American universities, we have to do these things in, 12, 14, 15 weeks. We don't have a ton of time, and we have to make some kind of decision. And I said, where am I going to end this class? Is it going to be the end of the Western Empire? Sometime in 475, at least we have a specific date for this. Or am I going to end with the beginning of Islam? As somebody who teaches and researches late antiquity and early Islam, it was really dear to me. I should definitely include this. But then I asked myself, exactly when do I stop here too? Am I going to end with the, kind of the first state formation of Muslims, the end of the Umayyads, maybe 750 is a good date. And then I immediately asked myself, well, when does Roman history actually end? When does the Roman Empire actually end? Is it going to be the Byzantines? And if I'm going to teach Byzantine history, how far am I going to go? And then the first week, actually, when I was discussing the syllabus with the students and gave them some room to actually, tell me what you wanted to see included, some people mentioned the Holy Romans. I said, wait a minute, should I include the Holy Roman Empire? These are all things that kind of came to me as I was first imagining and also negotiating the syllabus with the students. And I realized, well, should I take this all the way to 1453? The conquest of Constantinople, is it too far? So long story short, I guess I decided on just ending with some time with the beginning of early Islam. And I was thinking I was doing something really smart, and I looked Katrin's syllabus, and she actually does that. So she was kind of way ahead of me, introducing kind of early Islam into this structure. And of course, just the way we today think about early Islam as some kind of continuity from late antiquity, and extend classical antiquity through late antiquity to 850, 900, however you kind of periodize, is becoming something of a fashion. So I wanted to kind of bandwagon this fashion. But still, there were problems in all of this. And while I was going through the class, teaching it, giving maybe 1 week for the late Republic, 1 week for Octavian, etc., I realized we're telling a story with the syllabi that we create. Not only that, as historians, we are creating stories. So obviously, this is really the theory of Hayden White in his famous book, Meta History, where he says that, history writing is technically story writing. We are conveying some kind of plot to the people to the audience that we're writing for. And as historians, we often tell either a story of epic, tragic, satirical, comedic implantment. What I mean by this is that especially if you're doing this in Roman history, and especially if you cling to standards of 17th, 18th, 19th centuries of Roman history writing, you're telling a tragic story. This tragic story is all about Rome being wonderful, an excellent civilization for some time, Pax Romana, 5 good emperors, and suddenly something happens and it goes down. Now, as an historian, I know that this is a very inaccurate way of looking at Roman history. But once I write my syllabus in such a way that there is a climax, and then there's a hill that goes down, and then I try to explain to students that there's an end to the Roman Empire, and this end has to do with the barbarians, the rise of Christianity, the adoption of Christianity as the empire's religion, the rise of Islam, of all things. Even if I, in the way I look at things as an historian with nuance, by giving this as a syllabus to the students, I'm telling them a story. That there was a wonderful thing that emerged, rose, declined, and then died. And when I'm giving excuses for this death, for this decline, just like the way Gibbon would do in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, I'm giving them things, I guess, some food for thought by saying barbarians did, Christianity did, the rise of Islam did it. And then I suddenly stopped maybe halfway into the semester and said, is my syllabus telling this tragic story? So what is the kind of messaging I'm giving to students by presenting Roman history like this? So as soon as I recognized this, and again, this was actually still quite early in the semester, I thought of some remedies. How can I fix this? Obviously, one of the things that I meant to do from the beginning, but perhaps did it more emphatically as I went along, was questioning things like, the Pax Romana, did the concept of the 5 good emperors, or talking about the 3rd century as the crisis of the 3rd century. And how do you do this? How do you show students that we're not telling a story where there's a crescendo, there's a climax, and things kind of go downhill? So one of the things that I tried was obviously, and these are the things obviously a lot of Roman historians already do, right? Show the rest of the world for comparison. When we call the crisis of the 3rd century the climatic, political, cultural problems that the Romans had, well, around the same time, people were doing much better in the Sasanian Empire, in India, in China. So give them some perspective. Romans were actually only getting the trickle-down version of whatever Silk Road producing as wealth. So that's something I tried. I wanted to also give them the sense of, for whom is this Pax Romana? Maybe you want to ask the Nabateans around the time of Trajan whether they think this is wonderful for them, as they were absorbed into the empire rather violently. Well, why don't you ask the Judeans whether it was Pax Romana for them? So, of course, giving them this kind of perspective, this is nothing new. This is, I'm not inventing the wheel at any point. Also, showing them the diversity in the Roman world. The 3rd century could be a crisis for the emperors, maybe the elite, maybe Rome specifically. But what about North Africa? North Africa was doing much better around that time. So these are the kind of things that we normally already as scholars do. But still, the question of when I'm going to end Rome and what kind of a message I'm giving students by saying that, this wonderful Roman civilization, this great thing that these folks created came to an end. And there are all these kind of terrible reasons for why it came to an end. So what I did was, again, halfway through the semester, I squeezed Octavian, Augustus, into the dynasty that I was going to teach in 2 weeks. So I kind of reduced them into 1 week. And I said, the last week, I'm going to spend on whether Rome ended or not. Whether what we call the civilization has some kind of tragic end, so that we can today look back, lament, and say, if only we can bring back some of it. Well, did something better come out of it? Are we really talking about civilization? Again, I don't want to question the term itself. I wouldn't have the time for that. But at least, if I'm going to use it in the classroom, am I going to do it in a way students will not see this as some kind of tragic end? So I started the last class with this question. who inherited Rome? And I wanted to keep this as short as possible. I didn't say the Roman civilization. I didn't say the Roman Empire. I just said who inherited Rome, or I could have said also who succeeded Rome. And the students looked at this, right? And some of them gave, the answers A and B. It sounded, at least maybe in the name, it seemed to be the inheritors of the Romans. And the others looked a bit farcical, especially, D sounded to many of them like, I was joking. I just put them as a farcical answer. And then I asked them, what makes Rome Rome? I mean, I've been teaching this course for 11 weeks to you. What do you think makes Rome Rome? Some of them said it's the city of Rome. And as I said to them, if that's the case, we should have ended this class sometime around the reign of Diocletian in the 3rd century. Nobody cared about Rome after that point. Milan was rising, and obviously Diocletian didn't live in Rome. If that's your criteria, actually, if whoever is holding Rome is the inheritor of Rome, let's include the Holy Roman Empire as well. For some while, they actually did control Rome. While Byzantine Empire, at least the reign of Justinian definitely counts. And I also tell them, I can ask the same question to the audience here and to my fellow panelists. If any of you, I dare you actually, if any of you with time traveling capabilities would go back to the 6th century, speak to Justinian and tell them, people 1,500 years later are teaching Roman history and not including you, Justinian would be furious. He would be livid, right? I mean, this is the kind of message I wanted to give students. So if it is Rome, Byzantine Empire would, at least for a while, definitely count. So when I said them, they kind of opened up, they started questioning what makes Rome Rome, or the Roman civilization that civilization. Some of them mentioned the Christianity and becoming the patrons of Christianity. And I said, in that case, you could definitely count the Holy Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, maybe even the Catholic Church, and even Kievan Rus, at least the way they became protectors of the Orthodox religion for a while. And then somebody said, well, whatever was the capital of the empire at the end. Oh, you mean Constantinople? Well, I said, if that's the case, you could definitely count the Byzantine Empire, but also the Ottomans. It's not me imagining things. When Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, he started calling himself Caesar Rum, the Roman Caesar. This was not some kind of far-fetched imagination. People truly believed that they were the inheritors of the Roman, whatever, civilization, political legitimacy, etc., etc. And then I also, at the beginning of the class, I had told them it's the Mediterranean that kind of holds the Roman Empire together, right? I mean, at least physically, if we want to talk about some kind of physical border, they're what they called, our sea. And I said, if that is your criterion, Justinian's Byzantine Empire, or actually the Ottoman Empire, were the ones closest to some kind of Mediterranean supremacy. So just this simple question opened up so many avenues of discussion that, first of all, something that appears so far-fetched, like maybe the Umayyad Empire or the Ottoman Empire, is definitely part of this civilizational continuum. And not only that, this gives them a much larger perspective of what Rome represented for people, not only in modern times, but also in medieval times, in early modern times. So much so that obviously even fascists would at some point gain their legitimacy or at least inspiration from them. And this was for me some kind of eye-opening experience where our very simple decisions, very basic decisions in syllabus making, sometimes reinforce, sometimes reproduce some of the things we often complain about. And I think it's on us, at least partially, at least partly, to fix these things by, first of all, this is something that we're already doing, and I'm very happy about this, including Islam in parts of discussions in late antiquity. I, as holding a, chair in early Islam and late antiquity, became the kind of embodiment of this. I would definitely promote this. But on top of that, all these small decisions in syllabus making, in pedagogy, have to be very carefully done, have to be very diligently done. And I hope, again, my very small experience in this class could be useful to people. I'm very happy to gather their thoughts and advice on for this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Suleiman. Heba, are you ready to share your screen?
I stopped mine, so I think that, there we go.
You're on mute, Heba.
It wouldn't be Zoom without that. So I'd first like to begin by saying that a panel like this has been a long time coming for me. I'm very grateful to Katrin and Everyday Orientalism for offering this opportunity, because they sort of prompted me with the right kind of questions at the right time. You know, I felt ready to begin to take some of these on. And thinking through my identity as an Islamic art historian, for several decades, and especially since 9/11, Islamic art historians in the academy and museum, we've really been called upon to navigate this very treacherous terrain between what the public needs and expects, but also what we're trained for and qualified to do. And there's a big mismatch there. What we're willing to talk about, and if we're being totally honest, the conditions that would make it safe enough to do so. Reactions in our field have really run the gamut, and colleagues in the museum have arguably been on the front line of such debates. So today I'd like to focus my commentary on two of the questions, which I've paraphrased slightly. How can scholars of the early Islamic period disrupt narratives around this notion of civilization? And seeing how Suleiman is doing this in practice in the classroom is very inspirational. And if we consider narrative as a dynamic living entity, how should our narratives manifest? So this is sort of a broad framing of some of the questions that Katrin raised. And they're not so different from those embedded within the earliest Islamic textual tradition. For example, debates around what it meant to be civilized is a major theme in the Quran, with very real implications, especially for early Islamic architecture and material culture. And while conventional views of Muhammad's austerity, you know, the nature of his mosque in Medina as being simply built, his resistance to any sort of monumental or permanent architecture, it's really necessary for us to understand this as part of a kind of strategic framing, part of his prophetic charisma, but actually only one part of a spectrum of charisma, prophetic charisma, that could have also included wealth and splendor, if we think of David and Solomon, for example, right? So why are they sticking with this austerity narrative? And how it played out in practical terms actually might reveal a far more nuanced reality. And I'm pulling here from the wonderful work of Walid Saleh on adornment in early Islam, specifically in the context of the Quran. Because Muhammad's claims of austerity were very likely a carefully crafted rebuttal to circulating arguments that denied his prophethood and his ability to lead the community because of his penury and lack of wealth, essentially. Now, this counter argument, as communicated in the chapter of adornment in the Quran, challenged this claim that wealth somehow implied sanctity or prophethood, essentially stripping wealth and poverty of any association with either God's pleasure or displeasure, right? So it kind of stripped both extremes and rendered them kind of a neutral entity. The Quran focuses its criticism specifically on golden adornment, luxury objects, and monumental architecture, sometimes tethering them to a debased way of being, but only in this world, right? Luxury, comfort, and adornment were not stigmatized in the absolute. In fact, that's what's promised to the faithful in the afterlife. And not to sort of press this point, but there really is this problematization of what wealth and luxury actually means for Muslim being in the world. And so in a way, what we start to see it as a destabilizing counter argument for what it meant to be civilized. That was strategic and perhaps even had some sort of Marxist undertone. And what this did is that it offered early Muslims for that moment in time, and I use this term kind of broadly, a type of psychological buffer that stripped them of the stigma of poverty, right? And so it was sort of a necessary argument to be made that civilization is not necessarily linked to material wealth. And while this narrative was promulgated through various means, and we see it pop up in various textual traditions as well, very quickly it came up against the reality of what it meant to rule empire, right? Specifically lead an empire that had inherited, as Suleiman reminds us, inherited the classical and Byzantine tradition. And obviously the Sasanian as well. Because only 60 years later, this happened. So we're thinking about, prohibitions on adornment in gold. And we're looking at the interior of the Dome of the Rock, the golden adornment, the golden mosaic adornment. And just a few years later, this happened, right? Now, and this is the Great Mosque of Damascus, we're looking at the entry into the prayer hall by Caliph al-Walid I. So this uncomfortable coexistence of realities and the tension between them would eventually bubble to the surface. So just a few years later, Caliph Omar ibn Abdulaziz would whitewash these golden mosaics to conceal their splendor and boil the golden chains of the mosque lamps to rid them of their shine and luster. And for Omar, stripping the mosque of gold is what it meant to be civilized. So this instability certainly makes Muslim attitudes to civilization a really good starting point to challenge and dismantle any kind of static view of civilization and what Muslims, how they may have used these narratives. And this brings me to my final point. If we consider narrative a dynamic, living entity with an afterlife, how should our narratives manifest in the classroom for the public? And the more I think about it, the more it occurs to me that we should carefully consider the full life cycle of a narrative, right, that began perhaps during the life of the Prophet Muhammad and will continue long after we're gone, and our positionality within this life cycle. So not just its manifestation in the present moment, but sort of this historicization of narrative in the past, but also into the future. Should we be dismantling our pretense of any kind of academic distance and see ourselves as storytellers? And this really resonates with me when I heard Suleiman talk about teaching us storytelling. Should we be thinking in terms of stealth narratives, infiltrating insidious narratives that allow us to disarm counter narratives and sort of plant seeds that may not germinate till the next generation when they're sort of ready to hear it? Should we implement what scholars in the field of de-radicalization studies conceive of as a spectrum of persuasion, where basically extreme views shouldn't be tackled directly, but rather contiguous views, and then they sort of travel through the spectrum? Should we target the right people with the right narrative at the right time and think about where that narrative will land in the years to come? I obviously don't have any answers, but I very much look forward to the coming conversation because these are not academic questions for me. I get questions on WhatsApp all the time from family and loved ones that are screenshotting debates on social media that are in fact citing primary literature and debating serious academic questions, but they've entered the public debate in a way that is really fascinating to me. And I'm thinking here specifically of Arabic social media. I'm not really thinking of the Western public. I'm thinking of the public, my father, my brothers-in-law, and so on. And this really challenges me to think about what it means to be this storyteller, and have the trust, what it means to have that trust and what it means to engage on that level. So I really look forward to discussing this further, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Heba. Adam, I think you don't have a screen to share, but if you share your remarks, that would be great.
That's right. I'm so PowerPointed out at this point this semester that it didn't even cross my mind to make slides. Yeah, first of all, let me thank you very much, Katrin and Suleiman, for inviting me to be part of this panel and discussion. I think, as you know, I've been an admirer of everyday Orientalism for a while, and so it's an honor to be asked to participate now in your very valuable initiatives. And I also got the impression from previous sessions that it's something of a tradition for panelists in these events to kind of introduce their remarks by saying a few words about their positioning as workers and scholars. So I'll try to do that now before sharing a few general thoughts in the direction of today's topic. So I'm a Libyan American scholar. I completed my graduate studies and then initially worked in European academic systems in England and Germany. And I'm now employed in the California public university system in the field of ancient Iranian studies. And I mentioned these points in particular, and there's of course others, because none of these things that I've mentioned really follow naturally from one another. And each in their own way, they have much to do with varying combinations of circumstances and privileges besides my own sort of interests and goals. So like many people from the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine this year, I've observed with little surprise the racism and selective xenophobia of Western media and officials, what Katrin has aptly deemed a substantial flow of public Orientalism. I really like this phrasing. On social media, in response, many from outside of the civilized world, be they from a Muslim, African, Asian, or indigenous community, and this happens actually not irregularly, were quick to respond by attempting to demonstrate their own or their peers' level of civilization, having earned a PhD, having achieved a world-class level of skill in some game or sport, being appointed as a high-ranking official, being multilingual. Right? These and other attributes were held up as, in theory, conferring on their bearers membership among the civilized. But those who participated in this way forgot, or perhaps didn't realize, that it just doesn't work like this. You don't apply to be civilized, rather those in power confer it on you or don't. And the limits of civilization and the differences between civilizations become clear in these instances. Now, as scholars of antiquity, we are equipped, I won't say uniquely equipped, I think the phrasing is usually uniquely equipped, but it's simply not true that we're uniquely equipped to uncover, to critique, and to ultimately work to replace notions like civilization, which, if we use them, and I think Katrin will say something about this, we only end up using them in what are ultimately Eurocentric perspectives, i.e., there are only other civilizations if there is first a European or a Western civilization, right? And this, of course, is, after all, the very basis of the critique of Orientalism. In our teaching and our research, we must, and we do, reckon with the plurality of ancient societies, with their effects on each other and their mutually constitutive natures. I think Suleiman has alluded to this a little bit already. Unfortunately, the Sasanians who I teach about can't claim, they didn't get as far as the city of Rome, so they have no claim on that. But we, in this, we recognize that people throughout history, right, and people in the present time as well, have had their own conceptions of space, their own conceptions of time, of who is and is not like them, what claims about place and identity are valid and not valid. And by recognizing this and by sort of emphasizing this in our teaching, we can move towards decentering the modern views that we inherit and we teach as well. And if we're adept at teasing out and critiquing the ways of demarcating and making boundaries that existed in past societies, we must also endeavor in the same way to reveal and critique these in our modern era. And we must also emphasize the contingency of our own worldviews, social structures, and ideas about social relations, by which I mean we emphasize that ours are particular to our historical time and place and not universal. Of course, the same is true of the ancient societies that we teach and research about. And we must also insist on and develop the habit of teaching and discussing the past outside of modern nationalistic frameworks. We often project states, national cultures, and of course civilizations back into the past, and it's convenient to do so. But by doing so, we kind of cement this idea of like timeless, bounded, natural entities that undergirds the modern notion of civilization that we've been seeing at play in this public discourse, right? And I'm happy to sort of talk more about it later as well. I hadn't planned on saying so much about it at the outset, but of course, I'm also involved in researching and teaching about an ancient society to which there are many claims of succession, both in the past and up until the present. And that's, of course, ancient Iran, whatever that means. And there's quite a lot of misunderstanding about what that includes, and if there's, or that there is continuity between those ancient societies and the present nation state that bears the same name, or it's the other way around. But, so just to sort of sum this all up, I just want to say that because of the things that we engage in as scholars of activity, of antiquity, we cannot shy away from our responsibility to the present moment or moments. And so partly why I find this public forum and our participation in it so important, but also just to sort of emphasize that as scholars of antiquity, we have not only something to bring to the table, but a responsibility to do so. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Katrin, would you like to share your screen?
Yes, sure. Okay, hi everyone. First of all, I want to say that I'm really grateful to all of you who are here, and especially our panelists today, the guests who are sharing the screen with me. So I want kind of today to continue on the conversation about storytelling. In a way, I want to share with you the story of the genesis of this panel. So what led me to have a conversation with Suleiman and Anver, and eventually put the event together. So it actually starts with the word civilization. As I'm sure you all know, civilization is a word that sells. It's been ubiquitous in our cultural, political, institutional landscape, and it's an intellectual landscape as well for quite a while. So you have here a few examples of books, a vintage video game, Civilization, maybe some of you remember it, a museum and TV shows using or bearing that name. Now, a few years ago, I wondered, where does this word actually come from in European languages? So I ended up in a rabbit hole that led to a blog post that bears the same name as our panel today. So I should say Suleiman, like the title of the post. So he said, why don't we make it the title of the event? So this is where it's coming from. So if you want more details, you're welcome to go look at this post. And Rebecca Fito-Kennedy also wrote a fantastic two-part blog post on the history of Western civilization. But for today, in a nutshell, and you see it on the screen, what I want to emphasize is that the notions of civilized and civilization, as they are encapsulated in these words, are modern French constructions. So civilized is attested for the first time in the 16th century in the context of a commentary to Aristotle's Politics, to a section of book 8 about human ways of living. And it is followed over a century later by the first use of the word civilization by another French scholar, with also the same idea that is actually tied to the Hippocratic theory of the climate. So the idea is the civilized people live in temperate climates. They are sedentary, they live of agriculture, and they also live in villages and cities, right? So the further away you move in terms of climate to more extreme climate, the more barbarian you are. So very conveniently for the Greeks and later on for the French and the British, they so happen to live in the Ottoman geographical zone, right? So this is pretty obviously a fundamentally imperial construct that in its modern sense rationalizes the imperial expansion of France and of the British Empire that was going on at the time. So we need to see this as a kind of identity construct that is fueled both by a certain reception and misappropriation or use of Greco-Roman antiquity that are seen as the ancestors of modern Europe, and also as a embodiment of the kind of superior value of Christian European empires. So the second part of this story is bringing us to the very recent present, which is this past winter. I'm pretty sure all of you are aware that there were so-called freedom convoys, that is a protest and also a 5-week occupation of Ottawa in the winter by groups who claim to be against vaccine mandates for truckers, but it ended up being quite obviously about much more than that. So what I want to spend a few minutes talking about with you in this sharing is how these events, which are actually ongoing, right? We have protests downtown Toronto every weekend. How they are characterized, among other things, by a plethora of historical misappropriation. So we've seen some of them in the flesh during the protests, including, as you can see on the top left-hand side of the slide, at a protest in front of the Department of Classics of the U of T. This is a badly spelled Molon Labe flag with a Spartan helmet. But we've also seen these misappropriation in a leaked donor sheet that was leaked by a hacker group. It's a donor sheet that was part of the Give, Send, Go funding campaign in support of the truckers. So I was able to get a hold of that Excel spreadsheet. And it all started with a Twitter thread. I wonder, are there any allusions to the classical antiquity in this sheet? And I started typing words, and it mushroomed into over 200 tweet thread that expanded way beyond the Greek and Roman world to all historical references. So this led me to collaborate with Curtis Dozier and the team at Pharos, a site that documents far-right misappropriation of the so-called classical antiquity. And so his team actually went manually through the spreadsheet, which has 92,000 plus entries. So it's quite a long task to accomplish. And we published a post last week that offers a synthesis of how references to the classics are popping up in the spreadsheet, which in a way gives us an idea of what I would call the silent base of the convoy movement, right? And more broadly speaking, of the anti-vaccine and also white supremacist movement. Now I'm also working with a team of graduate students from the U of T who are also manually going through the spreadsheet and going through the pseudonyms, the email addresses, and also especially the comments, the public comments given by the donors, and tracking all historical references. This is the work in progress, kind of a little cloud of tagged words or categories that my team has put together. As you can see, this is going in all sorts of directions. We are not done. This is preliminary. And to conclude my sharing, I just want to say a few words on three categories that I think are particularly relevant for our conversation. So Western civilization, Greek and Roman history, and the Crusades. So the word civilization, with or without Western, comes up a lot in the comments. There are some gems, for instance, on the left-hand side, without truckers, there would be no Western civilization. There are two more comments going in the same direction on the screen, but there's way more. In general, the narrative, the story is that Canada is becoming a tyranny. Tyranny is another word that pops up a lot together with freedom, or a communist country. And the truckers are liberators who are working against oppression and autocracy. This narrative also leads to quite a lot of references to the Greek and Roman past. You can go back to the first post, it's expanding a bit on that. I'm giving you a few examples here. So Sparta is obviously a favorite, a lot of Molon Labe or badly spelled instances of it, mention of King Leonidas as well. And when it comes to the Roman world, there are quite a bit of references to figures who are seen as freedom fighters, fighting against the Roman imperial might. So Spartacus is one of them, but Boudica also pops up, Arminius also pops up. So we really see a kind of a historical landscape in which the donors identify with a view of the Greek and Roman past that is very much aligned with imperial and military narrative, and very much aligned with a classical past that they claim as, in a way, their ancestor. The second example, I wanted to also mention that we've seen beyond the flag in front of the Department of Classics, a few examples of that elsewhere in the convoy itself, in the protest and occupation. And the second example I want to mention is the Crusades, the theme of the Crusades, that also comes up quite a bit. As some of you might suspect, there's a lot of Christian content, especially in the comments, but also in some email address, the names of the email addresses, a lot of prayers, and quite a few references to Crusaders, to the Crusaders' motto Deus Vult, to the Templars, and to this idea of a holy war or anointed war. So these tropes are obviously fundamentally Islamophobic, and they are not new. They are to be contextualized within a much broader intellectual landscape that is spread worldwide, including in the United States, right? So we've seen quite a bit of medieval crusade imagery deployed in Washington during the attempted coup last year, together with classical misappropriation as well. It's still being done among Trump supporters. And there is on Facebook a Canadian group called Canadian Crusaders, who is and officially anti-vaccine, but it's anti much more things than that. So it's a white supremacist group. So, I mean, to sum up and to end, to me, this very present moment of the convoys and the way history pops up in its performance, both online and in person, really amounts to a form of Eurocentric and Orientalist weaponization of history. And that led me and Anver and Suleiman to really think about what is our responsibility in trying to counter that movement and occupy a space that otherwise lead to this type of violent and harmful misappropriation of history. So I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Katrin. I really thank you so much for all of your contributions, in particular for that sort of closing reflection on what is our responsibility. Katrin, you were picking up there on some of the language that Adam was using, and I feel like that underlay also many of both Heba and Suleiman's remarks, especially when Suleiman was asking, what kind of story are we telling with the syllabi we create? So I just want to pull out a few threads from what we've heard as we move into a discussion amongst the panelists, and then Q&A from those who are listening. I want to pull out a few threads with regard to history and story, civilization, and in particular civilization as at once defined in cultural terms, particularly as we heard from Suleiman in Rome, in terms of Rome, but also religious terms. And Katrin, you were sort of surfacing that dimension of the long history of civilization, understood as a religious as well as a social construct. I was so struck by the ways in which Suleiman drew on Hayden White to bring out for us the extent to which history writing always is story writing, and that applies to the syllabi that we structure the narratives with which we teach our students. And I was reflecting on the extent to which that's inevitable and unavoidable. In other words, it is impossible to communicate history without story. There's always a narrative. So the question has got to be not how can we avoid story, but rather how can we manage story? And Suleiman, you brought out some dimensions of that really beautifully. And Heba too, in thinking about not just the present moment in which our stories are articulated, but the horizon that lies behind, the extent to which there will be a future realization of some of the story that's told now. And I found myself reflecting too on maybe are there other modes of story that we can introduce into the classroom that will allow us to kind of tell that story in different ways. And here I'm thinking back to some of Katrin's work on taking seriously the work of Indigenous writers, knowledge keepers, and artists as we teach our methods classes especially. And there we perhaps provide other ways of understanding story, other ways of using story as a kind of a backbone for our understanding of the past, the present, and what lies ahead. So that might be something to reflect on either today or in the future. I was struck too by, with Suleiman's remarks about something you left out when you were talking about your students' responses to the question of, did Rome end? And if it did, when did it? And I love that part of what you were presenting to us, the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Catholic Church, the Ottoman Empire, Mussolini's fascist Italy, and Kievan Rus. And not that you left out in a negative way, but it's interesting to hear about what's speakable and what's less speakable. I don't know if they talked about the Third Reich, which explicitly constructs itself as a successor, not just to Rome of antiquity, but the Holy Roman Empire, and also something that sort of was in the background when Katrin was mentioning the assault on the Capitol on January 6th, the extent to which not only the sort of symbolism brought in by the rioters was invoking a classical past, but the architecture they were inhabiting was also invoking that classical past. Like they felt at home in those spaces, and there's a reason why, right? So, those are interesting dimensions to reflect on, both in themselves and also to think about, what emerges in the classroom, what doesn't. And part of that's the Canadian versus the U.S. context, but I feel like there are things that are harder to face. Maybe that's part of it. Heba's remarks were deeply moving, and I also found myself reflecting when she was talking about civilization and the ways in which that's manifested through adornment, and that sort of dynamic between adornment as a manifestation of civilization and other things that constitute civilization. I found myself reflecting on not just what civilization is, but what are the terms, what are the lexicons for what we're calling civilization? Katrin pointed out toward the end that we can identify a sort of early modern French coinage of that term, and we can therefore yoke it to colonial settlement practices in all kinds of interesting ways, seeing the ways in which a sort of Hippocratic logic of climate structuring all growing things, including racial divisions, right, got drawn into a sort of a early modern colonial moment in ways that reveal the suppleness and flexibility of Orientalist systems, right? Katrin, you were pointing out conveniently Greece and Rome were in the temperate zones. Well, for Britain, it took a lot more heavy lifting, right? Because that had been the extreme northern fringe, right? So you're looking at medieval texts on climate theory, they're all like, yeah, like England, really cold. And then once you get into the slightly later period, it's reinvented as, yeah, it's special and important, they'll say things like, if it is a corner, it is the most plenteous and abundant corner of the world, right? So that you can see the flexibility of the system. So thinking about the lexicons of civilization, I feel like is a really productive line of inquiry. I was struck when Adam was speaking about the extent to which civilization is not something you claim, but something that those in power confer on you or don't. That is, it's interpolated or recognized or seen. And I felt like that was such an important observation, both in terms of our excavation of the historical past and our reflection. I was very much struck by the work that Western civilization was doing there. And you brought out, Katrin, the extent to which that's, again, a sort of a social and cultural construct that draws on Rome in particular, Greco-Roman heritage, but yoked to a Christian fantasy that in some ways we can trace back to the Holy Roman Empire and even beyond, Orosius probably, right? But also having a certain kind of weight. And in that moment, I was reflecting on an article some of you may have seen in the New York Times back just about a week and a half ago about Hillsdale College. It was on the 10th of April was the reporting, but it's been there for a while. A college in Tennessee that has been working with charter schools to promote Western civilization. And the state of Tennessee has invited the college to start 50 schools with public funds from the state. So what you have is a kind of a educational machine that is understanding Western civilization and specifically Christocentric, often anti-Semitic and Islamophobic terms, and bringing them through the university system, training these teachers and sending them out to the charter schools, which are funded by the state, right? So Western civilization is doing a lot of very pernicious work. So I talked a little bit longer than I meant to, but that's just evidence of how stimulating the remarks each of you shared was. And I wonder if you have questions from one another or ways in which you also might like to draw out some of those strands. History and story, civilization, the lexicons of civilization, and again, our responsibilities. Did anybody want to share a little bit before we turn to the chat?
I actually have a question for Heba. So Heba, what you share about the Islamic notion of civilization made me wonder, like it made me think about my sharing, which focuses on European languages. So is there an equivalent at the time? Like what type of words are used in the literature of the time?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, but Suleiman, please jump in and help me out. Like thinking about it, like the Arabic term, hadara, which comes from hadar, which is linked to sedentary culture. And the opposite of that is sort of pastoralism and nomadic traditions or badewa. So there is this juxtaposition that's made, and it dates from definitely the pre-Islamic period. It's circulating for a long time before the rise of Islam, and is also very likely shaped by classical attitudes as well. So it's interesting to see that, you know, we have a similar sort of argument, like someone like Ibn Khaldun is very interested in bringing this out in his discussion of what it means to be civilized. I'm sorry, my doorbell's ringing. But yeah, that's a simple answer. But Suleiman, please follow up.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right. And I would add that, you know, once kind of Aristotle and Aristotelian thought became much more kind of widespread, you could definitely see the kind of connection between cities and urbanism as the kind of semantic equivalent of some kind of civilized, urbanized people versus, you know, nomads, people involved in pastoral nomadism. But of course, eventually, Medaniya becomes some kind of buzzword as well for in Arabic, and obviously not in Arabic, but Persian and Turkish, still connected to the idea of, you know, urbanism, city dwelling. But since I have the I'm unmuted, I can maybe go on and maybe say a couple of things about Suzanne's reflections. I mean, you definitely are. We're making decisions. We're making choices in telling our stories, and we cannot avoid telling stories. The question is, I mean, do we really frame them in such a way that we're kind of succumbing to earlier, you know, 19th century, 18th century history writing, where again, just like Ibn Khaldun would say, you know, civilizations rise up, reach a climax, and die down, and what happens to them? Because this is the kind of raw material we're giving to people so that they could say, you know, something died out because of the barbarians, something died out because of Islam. But for example, I at least in the class, I felt quite defenseless, I guess, as an early Islamist, is that I would make comments like, look, I mean, if succession was a terrible problem that Romans couldn't deal with so that they died out, well, look at Ottomans. They learned their lesson and they made a much better way of dealing with political succession. So these are the kind of things that I was trying to, I guess, stealthily, as it was mentioned earlier, to put into the class to say that we're really not talking about the pinnacle of civilization by any measure. when we talk about the Romans. We're really talking about one slice, one snapshot, which inspired a lot of people. But I should make sure that the story doesn't sound like a movie that ends badly for good people. Good people continue to live in different circumstances, often in better circumstances, by learning their lessons. So again, I mean, I'm simplifying this, but because in the classes, the nuance that we're looking for is not always there. It's our job to kind of instill them slowly, inject them slowly into the material that we teach.
Maybe I can
comment, Katrin?
Oh yes, I just want to add to what Suleiman was saying. And as Suleiman was making his sharing, I was thinking of Sarah Ahmed's idea of being a killjoy, right? In the context of feminism. So she has this expression of being a feminist killjoy. But I think, to me, one of my responsibilities in the classroom is to be kind of a history killjoy, or a historical killjoy in a way, right? So there's nothing I love more than dismantling or disrupting these stories and blurring the lines, right? So to me, this can be done because when we're talking about this idea that the classical world is special, often it ends up being interiorized as special because it's not contextualized. So if you just focus on one thing and you don't look outside, of course you'll think you're special. It's kind of a narcissistic view of history. But once you open the doors, both in terms of place and in terms of time, and also once you open interior door, right, looking at the complexity of these vast spaces, then everything crumbles. It's kind of not necessarily an equalizer, but it allows other stories to emerge. And to me, the benefits of doing that in the classroom, especially the undergraduate classroom, are immense, because if we do it in a way that is compelling and respectful of students and engages them, they will end up benefiting from that for much longer, right? So that brings in the question that Suleiman was posing of kind of the afterlives of these conversations. So to me, this idea of being a killjoy is kind of helpful.
I can just add on to that. I'm reminded as you're speaking, Katrin, of some of Adam's remarks about how important it is to sort of teach about the historical past outside of modern national frameworks, or at least drawing attention to the extent to which the apparent equivalence of modern nation states, how they line up and don't line up at all with the subject matter that's in the course. And one of the reasons I'm reflecting on that is I'm thinking about the incommensurability or potential to manage the kind of disruptive teaching that you were describing, Katrin, and the kind of work you're describing, Adam, within the existing structures that we have. So Suleiman, for example, was talking about, well, here's a course on, I just want to get the exact title, history and culture of the Roman world, right? That has a clearly defined starting point, right? But you can use that as, I don't want to say a Trojan horse, but you can use it in a strategic way to both provide the meta narrative that's expected and counter narratives. And sometimes that can be harder, that can be easier or harder to do depending on the circumstance, especially in light of the way our departments are shaped, thinking about your work on classics, Katrin, and also depending on the ways in which major and minor course distribution, like so many structures limit our ability to work in this way. And I wonder if that's something that others have been reflecting on and thinking about how to manage that, how to work inside these interstices.
Yeah, that's it's a struggle for sure, but it's something that we have to continue to try to think about, and as was said, sort of stealthily introduce different ways of understanding and breaking down a given topic. I mean, so I've been trying to create a sort of broad intro course on ancient Persia, for lack of a better term. And of course, it has to have some kind of title, and it has to have a compelling title that students are going to enroll for it. So these are like some of the constraints already, right? And at least I can opt for something a little bit more specific that actually appears in the sources, namely the epithet of Persia, to describe as a self-descriptor of the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires, rather than Iran, which is a little bit of a later concept. And but of course, Persia itself has all of these historical and modern connotations. So I'm kind of, but it's actually been inspiring to listen to this discussion, because I'm trying to think also about, okay, well, where does ancient Persia begin and end? And, for many people, it's the arrival of Islam, but actually, if anything, it's several centuries after that, that the various administrative structures and practices and so on and so forth start seriously shifting. But and I have this other class that I didn't choose the title, it was already on the books, called Religions of Ancient Iran. And I was initially kind of frustrated with this, because I thought, well, I'm going to have to then figure out a way of defining what ancient Iran is. But because of it being a sort of religious studies kind of framing, and already having religions in the plural in the title, this is actually helpful to say, well, look, ancient Iran actually, and from what we can tell, their view of these things was, I don't want to say pluralistic, maybe that's imposing a sort of different concept on, but various religious traditions and practices counted as part of sort of ancient Iran. So it wasn't really homogenous with respect to religion. And so this kind of helps me sneak more things into there sort of validly as part of ancient Iran, but keeping us actually quite broad and diverse. But at the same time, one has to explain the sort of, why does it apply? Why are late antique Babylonian Jews part of ancient Iran, right? Why are obscure groups like the Manichaeans part of ancient Iran, and so forth? So one still has to justify, using those sources. But I think it's also rewarding to do so, because it really broadens the received narrative that, of course, a lot of people have of this one-to-one correspondence between like the modern nation state of Iran and, the ancient empires, right?
Thanks, Adam. Do others have remarks, or should we turn to some questions from the audience? I saw a really interesting question that Natalie Rothman had put in. She said, thank you for a fascinating and very timely panel. You make a compelling case for teaching a course or a sequence of courses on translatio imperii, the multiple appropriations of Roman and other imperial forms, and the mobilization of these pasts and specific spurious periodizations in the service of new political projects. Natalie, I was thinking about Erosius too, thank you for this question. She goes on to say, this weaponization is easier to call out in some contexts than in others, but providing students with tools to analyze them may plant the seeds, as Heba suggests, well beyond any specific contexts. I thought that was a really interesting provocation. Do any of you want to respond to that? Thinking about course or sequence of courses on Rome, because it goes on, right?
I just want to say that, full disclosure, Natalie is our chair, Suleiman and my chair. So I'm very grateful to have her as our chair right now.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, that would be a fantastic class, because that's where Rome actually becomes relevant, truly relevant for teaching and research. And also, we can actually talk about, contemporary political formations that get their inspiration. And I'm very tempted to say that, for example, the way Ottoman history lives in Turkish imagination is a very similar format. So that's definitely a good way of thinking about, how these ancient formations still inspire us, and how it is, I would say, misused and sometimes used for new political formation. So I would, if Natalie at all, you want to think about a course like this, I'm on board. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, a lovely little detail to that. I mentioned Erosius, so late antique historian, where the term translatio imperii comes from, a really important source for medieval universal histories. and that very much that sort of rise and fall narrative, the civilizational narrative, but with a kind of supersession of history in this world by the rule of Christ, right? So you've got the religious dimension to Translatio Imperii baked right in this incredibly influential text, which was translated into Arabic relatively early on. It doesn't have a tremendously rich reception history as far as I know, but I remember reading a wonderful early article on it by Adam Miyashiro, and that's just a nice example of how a Roman paradigm for Translatio Imperii found its way into other kinds of environments at a relatively early date. Other responses to Natalie? Or I can go on. We've got Walid Salah's reference in there, brilliant. I mentioned in passing that, and I know this is a terrible topic, that you know, these charter schools, like this educational system that has been percolating, at the very least in the US. I'm not sure exactly how far advanced this is in Canada because it's very different public educational systems, and you don't have the charter school phenomenon in the same way. But there's this kind of ecosystem, this educational ecosystem that produces educators in Western civilization, specifically sort of Christocentric Western civilization, and charter schools, which exist alongside public fund. They use the funding that goes to public schools in order to create different kinds of educational environments. So they're not described as religious schools as such necessarily, but they have a distinctive character. It will not surprise you to learn that the racial demographics of charter schools and the racial demographics of these charter schools are very different. So, I mean, it's not something that I think any of us can directly impact, but it's a really sobering reminder of the political machine that's behind, that's weaponized Western civilization in a really dangerous way. And it's not just in this sort of chaotic, you know, trucker convoy, let's storm the Capitol kind of way, but in educational systems that are drawing resources away from public education. I don't know if there's much to say other than to say, yeah, it's terrible, but one wonders, what are the things we can do? I think, for example, from my perspective as a medievalist, the Medieval Academy of America has a K through 12 committee. It's always trying to generate educational resources that can go out to schools, and that's good work, but how much can that do up against these political systems? I don't know, but I give you a sense of urgency.
This is a very important question. I mean, we don't have the same type of schools in Canada, but I've been thinking a lot about the ongoing, chronic, and increasing defunding of the humanities and devaluation of the humanities. We could say worldwide, but you know, particularly in the Canadian and Ontarian context, and what it means in terms of the types of community we are creating. And a few years ago, I wrote this post about, I think history, I think it's entitled "History is Not a Plant." So it goes in the same vein as what Suleiman was saying about this rise and death of empires. But I was stupefied, though maybe I shouldn't have been, to realize that in Ontario, students will at most take 4 history courses before university. Now, how many of the overall population of Ontario goes to university, and how many among these people will enroll in a minor, major, or specialist in history? Like it's very few. So this means most people have at most 4 history courses. That is, if they take the electives. So I think there are 2 compulsory ones, and they're focusing essentially on Canadian history, obviously Canadian starting from Nouvelle France, and with a focus on the British like settler colonial presences. And I think there is 1 course on like kind of a Western civ. So what it means is that there is really what I call a historical illiteracy. And I'm not saying this in a condescending way. Like our public education system does not value and does not center the humanities, including history. So most people, and me too, as far as North American history was concerned, are walking through life not having a single clue where our present comes from and what past is embedded in our present. And so that leaves, there's kind of a void that ends up being taken over for those who are interested by public-facing productions, Discovery Channel, History Channel. And it's not always good. Sometimes it's good, but then also it can end up making it easier for misappropriations, such as the one far-right groups are using right now to get hold of people. And so to me, this is really a crucial problem. I'm not naive about it. I don't know how we can do these structural changes and fight these kind of machine, right? So right now I'm kind of doing what I can, which is, working on everyday Orientalism and using the classroom as a space where I can disrupt stories. I don't know what the rest of you think, because I'm really curious to know your thoughts on this question.
If I can follow up briefly, I think what's becoming very clear to me is that there's a real cost to silence, and what Katrin articulated about leaving a void, it will be filled with something. And one of the ways that I've become quite interested in how to be part of that is actually engaging at the level of the something that's going to fill the void. So my students always remind me that, they learn more about medieval Damascus from Assassin's Creed than they do from their courses, because, and that's just one example. Katrin mentioned documentaries and so on. And if we accept that no matter how vocal we are, our voice just is not at the frequency that will be heard in many of these places and in many of these spaces. And no matter how hard we try to defend our training and our credentials and the integrity of our institutions and the integrity of our methods, that could actually just push our audience farther and farther away, right? So it's our affiliation that could be alienating the audience we want to speak to, even if we want to believe it's not. And so how do we shapeshift? And how do we become embedded within the narratives that will fill the void? Because the void's there. And no matter how vocal we are, even if we try to fill it, it will probably maybe even backfire. So I'm just sort of preoccupied with that. I don't know what that looks like, and I'm not sure what form that would take. I know social media has become a way to keep your voice out there, but I do struggle with that personally for many reasons, some of which are, have a lot to do with what it means to be a vocal on this platform as an academic.
Thank you for that, Heba. When you say about there's a void there that will be filled with something, I could not agree more. And Katrin, you were talking a little bit earlier about the sort of defunding of the humanities and structures that make it difficult for students to have access to historical study in educational settings. It's not that history isn't important. It's incredibly valuable as a commodity, right? We look at history majors going down in university settings by and large, but if you look at sort of Ivy League institutions, history departments remain strong, right? History is incredibly powerful and it's going to be used. And there's a desire for historical knowledge, but where people are getting it from, like you were saying, they're hearing another frequency from what it is we are often able to provide. We have a number of interesting questions and comments about civilization, and I wanted to share a couple of these, and maybe I'll share a couple of them and then we can discuss it. Virginia Kloss asks, is civilization itself too fraught a word to use today in educational settings? For example, she says, I teach a course called Roman Civilization, and while I do spend some time in the course interrogating the term, I wonder if the title itself is implicitly aligned with Western Civ and the agenda of Western Civ. And just to add on a little bit more, Anver Emon also added, what interests him in this panel theme is that implicit in the presumptions of a civilization is the idea that one civilization is separable from another, and so raises the specter of borders and boundaries, which get policed coercively, intellectually, and epistemically. In thinking about movement across those borders, we might use the language of colonialism and imperialism, encounters, or trade, and so on. But as historians, we may rely on theories of empire and imperialism that all have a strong connection to the early modern and modern periods, such as Orientalism. I would not limit that to the early modern, but sure. But for us late antique and medievalists, we're disciplined to be careful not to impose contemporary theories of imperialism or colonialism too far back into history, giving prevailing ideas about periodization and what that implies methodologically. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's been some really interesting work on that, which we might want to discuss. And then Anver adds a little bit more. In maintaining that strict methodological attentiveness to periodization and the limits of theories such as Orientalism, are we undermining our creative scope with and across the histories you bring to the panel? And how do we do that in contemporary history departments that are tasked to design a curriculum that doesn't always welcome thinking contrary to the discipline itself? Again, the disciplinary containers, the administrative structures that are limiting what we can and cannot say. There's some additional comments on civilization in the chat. I'm looking at Girish's comment as well, but I want to not take up too much time in summarizing and ask you all for reflections on civilization and the extent to which it's useful or not useful as a term in the work we're trying to do.
If I may, I wanted to kind of engage with Enver's question, and this is something that I really think a lot about, the fact that we have disciplinary boundaries that are limiting us first as scholars, and then this is then spilling into the classroom. And I want to give very specific examples from my own work or the kind of things that I'm interested in. It is definitely true that the borders that we create about civilizations are, like, we know actually that they're completely useless. To imagine someone like John of Damascus as part of Christian civilization would be really funny to him if we kind of put ourselves in that situation, or maybe thinking of Saadia Gaon as a member of, let's say, Western civilization just because of his religion. That would all sound really crazy from their perspectives. But just because, you know, John of Damascus writes in Greek, and that is the bailiwick of classical studies, just like because Aquinas writes in Latin, although he is very much indebted and in conversation with Muslim thinkers, these kind of boundaries that we already put on ourselves is limiting the way we can look at these people much larger, much kind of spread in their breadth than we actually are making them in the classroom, in our research. So I still think, I mean, it starts with us first, and especially the way universities are organized, the way the departments are organized. And that's why, although it became such a, you know, overused buzzword, interdisciplinary, that's where it matters. Somebody that can straddle those lines and actually question them are the people that can actually give us the better answers. And it's very difficult, obviously. So I always imagined that somebody working on early Islamic Egypt should be first a classicist, because most of the papyri are in Greek, or at least bilingual. So is it Islamic history really, or is it the realm of classical studies? So there's so much to think about, because it really starts with our own disciplinary boundaries.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Other responses? I might also just sort of share Girish Daswani's comments, where he says, much of the usage of civilization resembles a romantic or progressive narrative of European history. He says how much he appreciates the methodological ways in which all of you have provided alternative stories and storytelling to problematize that dominant narrative. And so he asks, how does colonialism or settler colonialism as concepts, how do these feed into the term civilization, especially as we think about land relations, cultivation, agricultural development? I was thinking about the economic dimensions of this as well. And how can we revisit stories of the past when we see them through the lens of settler colonial conquest, including genocide and Eurocentric knowledge production and appropriation? There's a lot in that comment. I don't know if any of you would like to respond. I mean, you were bringing out a little bit, Katrin, the extent to which civilization is, as a term, at least as it emerges in the early modern setting, is all about land relation and cultivation. And I can't remember if it was, I think it was Heba who was also mentioning that comparable, if we look at pre-Islamic terms for civilization versus sedentary culture, they're posited in terms of sedentary cultures as opposed to nomadic cultures, right? So there's not just an agricultural model settlement model, but also an economic model that's embedded in that. And I don't know if that's too far afield from our topic, but it seems like a really important component, especially when we think about, I mean, what is driving the Western civilization narrative that's being put out in those charter schools I mentioned earlier. It's economically driven. There's no question about it, right? It's not ideology for ideology's sake. There's economic drivers underneath that for sure. And someone shared also information about the Alberta school curriculum's proposed changes, which will add more content on ancient Rome, less on Indigenous peoples. Right. So these are absolutely economic and political as much as anything else.
I mean,
I
if we bring
things and there's nothing.
I just, when you were talking about Gersh's comment, I actually think there is a direct link between the Western civilization trope. I mean, this was in Europe, as I said, created to justify imperial expansion. So this includes settler colonialism and the genocides that come in with it, right? And there's a direct link between that capitalism, neoliberalism, and the climate crisis. And the climate crisis is all about the land, right? So this is a loop. And to me, this is another fundamental reason why we kind of need to, in a way, stop categorizing ancient history as ancient. Like, if you look at it on the scope of the Earth's history, it was a minute ago, but also there are different ways to look at time. And I forget now the title of the book, but it's by a knowledge keeper who's a member of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And he's sharing oral history about how Europeans arrive in settler colonialism. And the way it is rendered, you really see the 16th and 17th century as very recent. So ancient history needs to stop being categorized like as a category like pre-1500. Like, we really need to see that this was not long ago. So anyways, this is a bit existential, but I think all of this is actually related.
It comes back to the earlier discussion of periodization, right? It's easy to see periodization as some sort of like pedagogical method or some way of organizing content. And to some extent it is, but it's also this incredibly powerful set of tools that enables things like what you're describing, like settler colonial activity, and justifies it, right? I mean, the very notion that, how can I put it, the way in which some land acknowledgements seem to do little more than say, oh, thank you, people who are not here anymore, for looking after these territories, right? You know, there's periodization going on there in a particularly pernicious and awful way. A maybe possibly related question to some of the points you're making, Katrin, is here in the chat from Chad White, who asks, more and more I'm disliking the term of classical history or classical languages in the same way that Anglo-Saxon is falling out of favor as a disciplinary term. Who decided that Greek, Latin, Mediterranean was classic? I think the language that we use for these terms shapes our understanding and our grounding. I feel like Katrin is going, yes. And you and Suleiman too, I think in your work out at UTSC, you know, you've been working within and against the classics container. It's interesting to see how that work's playing out and how it's similar to in some ways and also different from in some ways comparable conversations within medieval studies, where religious orientation plays a different kind of role, and especially the rhetoric of crusade and the historical reality of crusade plays a slightly different kind of role. Finally, I'm noticing an exchange that Suleiman had with Arafat Razak.
Yeah, he brought up this article by Kevin Van Bladel. And obviously this discussion, you know, the term civilization and its use for Islam or Islamic civilization itself is problematic as well, because it also brings out some of the kind of misappropriations and biases that we talked about in other contexts in Roman civilization. But one thing that I got, I guess, reminded of while you were speaking, Suzanne, is this issue of you know, I was talking about this disciplinary boundaries, and especially languages. And I think the way it works, especially in terms of the stories that we're creating, is since almost all kind of modern historiography was done in the spirit of capitalism in one way or another, the way we even decide whether civilizations work or not, it has to do with our own perception of efficiency. And I suddenly realized while I was teaching students, the fact that Rome's, for example, the city of Rome's population fell down, that urbanism became less favorable. I talk about the decline of Rome, and I stopped at a moment and said, well, is this a good measure of good civilization? Shall we ask people that were living in the countryside, probably much happier than, let's say, in the city of Rome, whether this has really declined? But I realized that the basic assumption that I had, and maybe all historians have, is that the efficient use of land and whatever resources that we have somehow were instilled in our minds as a form of or a measure of civilization. And that's why I think Grisha's comment is really valuable. We even put those kind of assumptions in the way we look at ancient history, and kind of we maybe judge, let's say, so-called the Dark Ages of Europe simply because they were not efficient users of land and resources. And even that I would doubt, but at least that's the way we look at them. So I feel like capitalism is kind of underlying some of these basic assumptions about land use and efficiency. And we think civilization is all about, exploiting better. And when you stop exploiting better, you suddenly are not civilized enough.
It's a devastating way to put it. Yeah, thank you for that. Lana Radloff has added a comment that Quebec too had intended to revise the curriculum, but that revision, which would have included more information on residential schools and Indigenous communities, but that revision has been put off. So we'll keep an eye on how that develops. I'm looking at the time, and we're a little bit past our 90-minute period that we'd initially specified. I wonder if any of you would like to share any closing thoughts as we come to the end.
One very quick thought, which is something that is coming up more and more in my classroom over the years, is actually engaging with Islam's colonial practices, right? So thinking of the histories of settlement that occurred in the early Islamic period, but also to observe and track what's happening in public narratives around settlement in the Islamic world, right? So whether Muslims were colonialists. I'm thinking specifically of a book that was published about a decade ago on the Muslim conquests that tried to foreground what happened to the indigenous populations. And that's a very interesting trend. And just to sort of alert you to the fact that these conversations are happening. And I'm thinking specifically of Egypt with the indigenous populations. And it's interesting to see that as scholars of Islam, we're always talking about our experience of colonialism on the other end of it. But in fact, a more important and maybe more productive conversation that's being pulled out in the classroom is in fact the role of Islam on the other side. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else?
I just wanted to, I think that we kind of skirted around this topic and didn't really get into this. The question that I think Virginia asked about, is it really, should we talk about civilization? Or somebody else asked, should we really talk about classics? If it were definitely up to us, I think maybe Katrin and I, we would definitely stop using those terms, even in the kind of the way our department works. But I also feel like that's the big issue in front of us. How far can we problematize them so that people understand something else when I say classics and when I say civilization? Is it at all possible, or should we just take it out of our curriculum? I'm not the person to say this, but I just wanted to echo that this is an important discussion. How far can you problematize a concept so that it's no longer in use, or at least people understand it differently? I don't know our limit. I don't know how far we can go, but it's definitely something in the back of my mind all the time as somebody in classical studies program at UTSC.
Adam or Katrin, any last remarks?
Adam, go ahead first.
No, thank you. I'm still kind of sitting with some of the questions, particularly Girish's question, that I have to sort of work through, I think, over the weekend. But I think it's really valuable for us to kind of come together and think about these concepts that are so, at once, so easy to understand and so widely used, and yet deeply problematic and sometimes almost meaningless, as a, and not necessarily in the direction of deciding should we or should we no longer use this term, but what do we really mean when we use it, and are we trying to say something else, and what can we instead be more precise with, especially in, I think for most of this session, we've been thinking a little bit about how we present these things in the classroom and in our teaching practices. And so, that specifically, of course, it's hard to, get rid of a term like this in our just daily use, right? Our daily casual use, but specifically in the classroom. So it's really valuable to try to think along with this. It's kind of just, it's kind of funny because I just came from a small conference I was hosting on philology, and of course philologists are often teased for hyper focusing on one specific word, but there are times in which focusing on one word and its uses and misuses is actually very productive, right?
Yeah, thank you. Katrin?
I just want to thank everyone, really. I'm very grateful for all of you to be part of this conversation today. And thank you to Anwar as well, Nisa, and everyone who showed up in the audience, in the virtual audience, in the chat, and in the Q&A.
Yeah, just to reinforce Katrin's comments and to encourage this conversation to continue, which I know it will do, whether it's through everyday Orientalism activity or other kinds of sharing. I love this closing reflection that Gary shared about our disciplines, disciplinary rigidity, the ways in which disciplines allow or don't allow certain kinds of things. I feel like these conversations are doing a lot of work to make those borderlines more supple and to respond to an environment where disciplinary walls are shifting, and it's up to us really to try to guide and govern where these are going to end up. So thank you all so much, and take care.